No one marries a Chinese girl, sir. I have seen it. They are for laundry, or for other things in the dark that are not spoken of in the daylight, but they are not for marrying. Lin Yue's voice was a whisper, a sound as delicate as the frost-etching patterns on the window pane of the land agent's office. Her hands, raw and chapped from lie and cold, were clasped so tightly the knuckles shone white against her skin. She kept her gaze fixed on the dusty floorboards, unable to meet the eyes of the man who stood before her, a man who smelled of pine and cold air and something else she couldn't name. Solitude, perhaps. My father is gone. The debt is all that is left of him. But I can cook, she added, the words rushing out, a final desperate offering into the heavy silence. I can make a meal from almost nothing. I can make a home feel warm even when the fire is low. I can work from before the sun rises until long after it is set. I promise I will not be a burden. She finally risked a glance upwards. The man, Jedediah Stone, was not what she had expected. He was not old and paunchy like the merchants, nor was he loud and swaggering like the cowboys who clattered down the main street of Whispering Creek. He was tall and broad, his stillness a stark contrast to the town's nervous energy. His face was weathered by sun and wind, etched with lines that spoke of hardship. But his eyes were a clear, startling gray, and they watched her with an unnerving intensity, devoid of the usual scorn or pity. He looked from her small, trembling form, clad in a worn but clean prairie dress the color of dried blood, to the smirking land agent behind the desk. Then his gaze returned to her. The silence stretched, each second a stone dropping into the well of her fear. He was going to laugh, or sneer, or simply turn and walk away, leaving her to the fate the agent had so crudely outlined. Instead, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "The debt is $500, he stated, his voice a low rumble, like distant thunder. The agent confirmed the amount with a greedy glint in his eye. Jedediah reached into his coat, pulling out a leather pouch. He counted out the coins onto the desk, the metallic clink, the sound of chains both breaking and binding. He slid the bill of sale across the worn wood. "The parson is at the church. He'll be expecting us." He didn't offer a hand. He didn't offer a smile. He simply turned and held the door open, a silent command. As Lin Yue walked past him out into the biting winter air, she felt not the relief of salvation, but the profound, chilling weight of a bargain struck. She was no longer indebted to a dead man's ledger. She was bound to a living one, a stranger whose silence was as vast and unknowable as the snow-covered plains that stretched out before them. The journey to his ranch was a study in silence, broken only by the crunch of snow beneath the wagon wheels and the rhythmic jingle of the horse's harness. Lin Yo sat rigidly on the wooden bench, her few belongings, a small bundle of clothes and a worn lacquered box containing her mother's utensils, tucked at her feet. Jedediah Stone handled the reins with an economy of motion, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his profile as stark and unyielding as the granite peaks that clawed at the pale winter sky. The cold was a physical thing, a creature with teeth that gnawed at her through the thin fabric of her dress. She had never known a cold so deep, so absolute. It was a cold that seemed to emanate not just from the endless white landscape, but from the man sitting beside her. She stole glances at him, trying to read the unreadable map of his face. Was there kindness there? Cruelty? Or was there simply nothing? An emptiness that mirrored the vast, lonely expanse around them. She was a piece of property he had acquired, a cook to warm his hearth and fill his belly. The thought should have been terrifying, and it was, but beneath the fear was a stubborn, flickering ember of resolve. She had made a promise. "I can make a home feel warm." The words echoed in her mind, a vow made in desperation that had now become her sole purpose. As the sun began to bleed its final orange and purple light across the snow, a structure emerged from the starkness. It was a small, solid-looking cabin of dark, weathered logs, with a plume of smoke rising bravely from a stone chimney. A barn stood nearby, equally sturdy. It was not a place of beauty or comfort, but of survival. It was isolated, a world unto itself, nestled in a shallow valley that offered some protection from the wind. This, she thought, was a house built by a man who expected nothing from the world and was prepared to face it alone. He brought the wagon to a halt and dismounted, his movements still marked by that quiet efficiency. He didn't speak, simply began unhitching the horse. Lin Yue climbed down, her legs stiff and numb. The air was even colder here, sharp and clean in her lungs. She followed him inside. The cabin was a single room, dominated by a large stone fireplace where embers glowed faintly. A rough-hewn table with 2 chairs, a bed in the corner, and shelves holding a few tin plates and cups. It was stark, masculine, and achingly lonely. He gestured toward the bed. "That's yours." He then pointed to a pile of furs and blankets near the hearth. "I'll sleep here." The words were practical, devoid of any emotion, yet they were the most he had said all day. He left to tend to the horse, leaving her alone in the deepening twilight. Lin Yue stood in the center of the room, the silence pressing in on her. This was her new life. A cold room, a silent man, an uncertain future. She walked to the hearth, her sanctuary and her proving ground. She knelt, coaxing the embers back to life, the first small act of defiance against the cold and the dark. The pantry was as sparse as the rest of the cabin, but it was not empty. There were sacks of flour and cornmeal, dried beans, a side of salted pork hanging from a hook, a few hearty root vegetables in a crate. It was the larder of a man who prepared for long winters, a man who understood sustenance over flavor. For Lin Yu, it was a canvas. She found an apron in her bundle and tied it around her waist, the familiar ritual a small comfort in this strange new world. Her hands, which had been trembling with cold and fear, steadied as she began to work. This was her language, the one she spoke with absolute fluency. She minced the tough salted pork into tiny pieces, rendering the fat in a heavy iron skillet until it sizzled and sang. To this she added finely chopped onions and carrots, letting them soften and sweeten in the hot fat, their aroma the first true scent of home to permeate the cold air. From the cornmeal she made a thick, savory porridge, stirring it patiently until it was smooth and creamy. It was simple food, peasant food, but she prepared it with the same reverence she would have given an imperial banquet. It was an offering, a statement. This is who I am. This is what I can do. When Jedediah returned, stamping the snow from his boots, he stopped just inside the door. The air was no longer just cold and smoky. It was filled with the rich, comforting smell of cooking. He looked from the bubbling skillet to Lin Yu, who stood by the hearth, her face flushed from the heat, her dark red dress a vibrant splash of color in the monochrome cabin. She did not speak, but simply ladled the steaming porridge into 2 tin bowls, topping it with the savory mixture of pork and vegetables. She placed 1 bowl on the table before him and sat down with her own. He sat opposite her, his large frame seeming to dwarf the small chair. He picked up his spoon and looked down at the bowl. It was not the bland, functional mush he was used to. It was something else entirely. The aroma alone was a promise of warmth and nourishment. He took a bite. His expression did not change, but a stillness came over him. He took another, then another, eating with a slow, deliberate focus. Lin Yue watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. She ate little herself, her appetite stolen by anxiety. The silence was thick, but it had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft sounds of eating, of a shared meal. He finished the entire bowl, scraping the sides clean with his spoon. He looked at it for a long moment, then set it down. He raised his gaze to meet hers across the table. For the first time, she saw something flicker in the depths of his gray eyes. Not praise, not gratitude, but a quiet, profound acknowledgement. He gave a single, slow nod. And in that simple, silent gesture, Lin Yue understood. He had heard her. Life on the ranch fell into a quiet, predictable rhythm, a silent dance choreographed by the rising and setting of the winter sun. Jedediah would rise before dawn, his movements quiet as he pulled on his heavy coat and boots to face the biting cold of his morning chores. By the time he returned, the cabin would be filled with the scent of coffee and sizzling bacon or warm bread, a stark contrast to the sterile emptiness he had known for so long. Lin Yue was a ghost of efficiency. She learned the landscape of her new life, the creak of each floorboard, the way the light fell across the room at different times of day. The cabin, once just a shelter, began to transform under her touch. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed, polished the few tin plates until they shone like silver, and kept the fire in the hearth not just alive, but cheerfully crackling, a warm and constant heart in the center of their shared space. One day, while Jedediah was in town for supplies, a journey he always made alone, a silent acknowledgement of the stares and whispers that would follow them as a couple, she found a small, sheltered patch of earth beneath the cabin's single window, where the sun lingered longest. With a purloined spoon and a fierce determination, she broke through the frozen topsoil. In this small plot, she planted the precious, dried seeds she had carried with her from the city: garlic, ginger, and a few hardy herbs. It was a foolish act in the dead of winter, a gesture of irrational hope, but the act of planting something, of tending to it, was an anchor to her own identity. She was not just a cook. She was a creator, a nurturer. Jedediah returned late that evening, the wagon laden with sacks of flour and other necessities. He said nothing of her small, disturbed patch of earth, though she knew he must have seen it. They ate their dinner in the usual quiet, the space between them filled with the unspoken thoughts of their day apart. After the meal, as she was washing the dishes, he silently placed something on the table. It was a small, clumsily wrapped parcel of brown paper. She dried her hands and hesitantly opened it. Inside was a small tin of tea. Not the coarse, cheap dust sold for pennies at the general store, but fragrant, whole leaves, the kind she had not seen since leaving her home across the ocean. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a question she dared not ask. He was looking at the fire, his profile silhouetted by the flames, but she saw the slight tension in his jaw. The storekeeper said it was from China, he mumbled, the words gruff, as if he were embarrassed by the gesture. It was more than tea. It was a message. I see you. Not just the hands that cooked his meals, but the woman who longed for the familiar taste of home. That night, as the aroma of jasmine filled the small cabin, the silence between them felt less like an empty chasm and more like a shared, peaceful space. The blizzard arrived without warning, a monstrous, howling entity that descended from the mountains and swallowed the world in a vortex of white. One moment the sky was a sheet of dull pewter. The next, the air was so thick with driving snow that the barn, only 50 yards away, vanished completely. The wind shrieked like a banshee, rattling the single window and finding every tiny crack in the log walls to send icy tendrils snaking into the room. Jedediah had managed to get the livestock into the barn just before the worst of it hit, his face grim and his movements urgent. Now they were trapped. The cabin, which had once felt isolating, became their entire universe, a tiny fortress against the elemental fury raging outside. The world was reduced to the four walls of the room, the roaring of the wind, and the steady, reassuring crackle of the hearth. For 3 days the storm raged. Time lost its meaning, measured not by the sun, but by the rhythm of their chores. Jedediah would brave the maelstrom twice a day to check on the animals, returning encrusted in snow, his face raw from the wind. Inside, Lin Yu kept the fire roaring, the flames a defiant beacon of warmth and light. She cooked, not just for sustenance, but to fill the cabin with the comforting sense of baking bread and simmering stew, pushing back against the sterile howl of the wind. They spoke little, but the forced proximity wove a new kind of intimacy between them. They moved around each other in the small space with an unconscious grace, a silent awareness of each other's presence. On the second night of the storm, a new sound pierced the din, a high, distressed bleating from the direction of the barn. Jedediah's head snapped up. "A new lamb," he said, his voice tight with concern. "Too soon. The ewe will be in trouble." Without another word, he pulled on his coat. But this time, as he reached for the door, Lin Yu was there, holding out a lantern and a bundle of clean cloths. "I am coming with you," she said. It was not a request. He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her eyes, and for the first time, he didn't argue. He simply nodded, holding a rope for her to grip as they plunged into the blinding chaos. The journey to the barn was a brutal battle. The wind tore at them, and the snow was waist deep in places. Inside the relative quiet of the barn, they found the ewe struggling, the lamb breech. Working together by the flickering lantern light, guided by his knowledge of animals and her small, nimble hands, they managed to turn the lamb and deliver it. It was a messy, exhausting ordeal, but as the tiny creature finally took its first shaky breath, a profound sense of shared victory settled over them. Huddled in the hay, shivering but triumphant, they looked at each other, and the last of the walls between them seemed to crumble into dust. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, the world was reborn, pristine and silent under a blanket of brilliant white snow. The fury of the blizzard had scoured the air clean, and the sun shone with a dazzling intensity on the transformed landscape. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere had undergone a similar transformation. The silence that returned was not the tense, uncertain quiet of their early days, but a deep, comfortable stillness, the kind that exists only between two people who have weathered a storm together and emerged changed on the other side. The shared ordeal in the barn had broken the seal on Jedediah's stoicism. He began to speak more, not in long monologues, but in small, offered fragments of himself. One evening, as he mended a piece of tack by the fire, he told her about his father, a trapper who had taught him how to read the land and respect its power. Another time, while watching her tend to her now thriving indoor herb pots, he spoke of his dream to one day have a small herd of his own, not just the few animals he currently owned. These were not grand confessions, but they were precious, each word a carefully chosen stone laid on the foundation of their burgeoning connection. Lin Ye, in turn, found her own voice. She told him of the bustling city she had left behind, of the sense of the market, of the stories her mother used to tell her while they folded dumplings. She spoke of her fear upon arriving in this vast, empty country, and of the hope she had clung to like a single precious coin. As they talked, she began to see the man behind the silent facade, a man of profound integrity, of quiet dreams, and of a deep-seated loneliness she now understood because she had once shared it. She started to feel a sense of belonging that had nothing to do with the bill of sale he had paid. It was a feeling that grew from shared laughter over a misshapen loaf of bread, from the way he would now instinctively add wood to the fire when he saw her shiver, from the soft look in his eyes when he watched her cook. One afternoon, she was kneading dough on the table, her hands covered in flour. He came and stood beside her, watching for a moment. Then, with a hesitant finger, he reached out and gently wiped a smudge of flour from her cheek. His touch was feather light, yet it sent a jolt of warmth through her entire body. She looked up at him, and in the clear gray of his eyes she saw not an owner, not a stranger, but a partner. She was no longer just his cook. She was becoming his home, just as he was becoming hers. When the snow had melted enough to make the path passable, Jedediah hitched the wagon for a trip to Whispering Creek. This time, when he looked at Linye, there was an unspoken question in his eyes. "I will come," she said, her voice steady. She would no longer hide. She put on her dark red dress, which she had mended and cared for, and for the first time she rode into town sitting not with the rigid posture of a possession, but as a woman beside her husband. The town had been hit hard by the blizzard. The supply train was delayed indefinitely, and a sickness born of cold and hunger had begun to creep through the small collection of houses. Faces were pinched with worry, and the usual boisterous energy of the main street was replaced by a grim, anxious quiet. As they walked toward the general store, the whispers and stares followed them, but now they were edged with a different quality, not just prejudice, but a sharp, hungry envy. Jedediah's foresight meant their own larder was still respectably full, a fact that was not lost on the townsfolk who saw him loading sacks of flour that were no longer available for purchase. In the store, the tension was palpable. Mrs. Gable, the storekeeper's wife, who had always looked at Lin Yu as if she were a piece of dirt on the floor, watched her with narrowed, resentful eyes. A child coughed weakly in a corner, and his mother's gaze fell upon the small tin of tea Jedediah placed on the counter, her expression a mixture of longing and despair. Lin Yu's heart ached. She saw in their faces the same desperation she had felt on her first day in this town. They were cold, they were hungry, and they were afraid. They had been cruel to her, had judged her without knowing her, but their suffering was real. That evening, back at the warmth of their own hearth, the image of the coughing child and the hungry faces haunted her. She looked at their own stores, at the abundance they possessed through prudence and hard work. An idea, bold and terrifying, began to form in her mind. She turned to Jedediah, who was watching the fire, his face thoughtful. "They are hungry," she said softly. "We have enough. We have more than enough." He looked at her, his gray eyes searching her face. He knew what she was thinking before she said the words. "I can make a stew," she said, her voice gaining strength. "A big one, enough for everyone. We can take it to the church hall. We can feed them." It was a radical proposition, to offer kindness to those who had only ever shown her contempt. It was a test of her own spirit, a chance to be the person she wanted to be, not the one they saw her as. Jedediah listened, his expression unreadable. Then he gave the same slow, deliberate nod he had given her on that very first day. It was a nod of trust, of partnership, of unequivocal support. The next day, the largest pot Jedediah owned was set to simmer over the hearth, filling the cabin with a scent so rich and deeply comforting it felt like a prayer. Linye worked with a focused intensity, transforming their stores into a miracle of nourishment. She browned chunks of salted pork and the last of their venison, adding onions, carrots, and potatoes, letting them soften and release their sweetness. She added dried herbs, a spoonful of precious ginger, and a broth she had been simmering for hours from roasted bones. The stew was a testament to her philosophy that the most humble ingredients, when treated with care and intention, could create something extraordinary. It was more than food. It was a distillation of warmth, of home, of unwavering hope. When it was ready, they loaded the heavy pot into the wagon and drove into town. Word had spread. carried on the cold air like a strange rumor. A meal, offered by the rancher and his Chinese wife. At the church hall, a small, cold room with bare wooden benches, the townsfolk gathered. They came hesitantly, a collection of skeptics drawn by the undeniable, desperate gnawing in their bellies. Their faces were a mixture of suspicion, pride, and shame. They stood in sullen groups, avoiding Lin Yue's eyes, their prejudice a threadbare cloak against the cold. Lin Yue, with Jedediah standing quietly by her side, did not speak. She simply tied on her apron and began to serve. She ladled the thick, fragrant stew into every bowl that was offered, her movements graceful and calm. The aroma filled the hall first, a silent ambassador that spoke a universal language. It smelled of safety. It smelled of sustenance. It smelled of a warm fire on a cold night. The first to eat was the mother of the sick child, her pride finally broken by her son's weak cries. She took a spoonful, then another, and the hard lines of her face seemed to soften as the warmth spread through her. Slowly, others followed. The blacksmith, the farrier, Mrs. Gable from the store. They ate in silence at first, the only sound the scraping of spoons against tin bowls. But as the food warmed them from the inside out, a change began to occur. The stew was not just filling, it was delicious, complex, and deeply satisfying in a way none of them could have imagined. It tasted of a care they had not known. They began to look at the small, quiet woman behind the pot. They saw not a strange outsider, but the hands that had created this moment of grace in their time of need. When everyone had eaten their fill, Mrs. Gable, a woman known for her sharp tongue, approached the table. She held her empty bowl in her hands, her gaze for once not filled with scorn, but with a reluctant, dawning respect. "Thank you," she said, the words quiet but clear in the silent hall. "Thank you, ma'am." One by one, others echoed her, their voices a chorus of gratitude that finally, irrevocably, washed away the old whispers of contempt. Just as the first green shoots of spring began to push through the thawing earth, a shadow from the past fell across their newfound peace. A man arrived in Whispering Creek, a man whose polished city boots and tailored coat stood in stark contrast to the town's rustic simplicity. He was slim and pale, with eyes that held a cold, predatory glint. He asked questions at the saloon, his voice smooth and persuasive, and it did not take him long to find what he was looking for. His name was Mr. Chen, and he was the man to whom Lin Yue's father had been truly, deeply indebted, not for money, but for her passage from China, a debt of a different, more sinister kind. He had come to collect. He found them in front of the general store loading supplies. He approached Lin Yue with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Ah, little sparrow," he said in her native tongue, his voice oozing a possessive familiarity. "You have flown far, but all birds must eventually return to their cage." Lin Yue froze, the sack of flour in her hands suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. The blood drained from her face. This was the man from her nightmares, the architect of her father's desperation. Jedediah stepped forward, placing himself between them, a silent, solid wall. "She is my wife," he said, his voice a low growl. "Mr. Chen laughed, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Wife?" He switched to heavily accented English for the benefit of the gathering crowd. "This is not a wife. This is collateral. Her father promised her to me. She is my property, a debt to be paid." He held up a piece of paper, a contract signed with her father's desperate scrawl. The townspeople, who had begun to gather, murmured amongst themselves. It was a familiar, ugly story. But this time, something was different. They were not looking at Lin Yue with scorn. They were looking at the man who threatened the woman who had fed them, the woman who had shown them kindness when they had shown her none. Mrs. Gable stepped out from the store, her arms crossed. "She's Mrs. Stone," she declared, her voice sharp. "She belongs here with her husband, not with the likes of you." The blacksmith moved to stand near Jedediah, his large frame a silent statement of support. Mr. Chen's smile faltered. He had expected to find a lone, frightened girl, easily intimidated. He had not expected a community. "This is a legal contract," he hissed, waving the paper. "She is mine." Lin Yue found her voice, a strength she didn't know she possessed, rising within her. "I am not property," she said, her English clear and steady. She looked not at Chen, but at Jedediah, her heart in her eyes. Jedediah's gaze never left Chen's. "The paper says you are owed a debt," he said, his voice dangerously calm. He reached into his coat and pulled out his leather pouch. He threw it onto the dusty ground at Chen's feet. "There is your money. Now get off my land." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the town. "Our land." Mr. Chen looked from the pouch to the silent, hostile faces surrounding him. He had been defeated, not by force, but by a quiet, unshakable solidarity. With a final, venomous glare, he snatched the pouch from the dirt and stalked away, his polished boots sullied by the mud of Whispering Creek. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, but it was a silence born of deep, overwhelming emotion. The confrontation in town had stripped away the last vestiges of their formal arrangement, laying bare the truth of what had grown between them. It was no longer a bargain or a partnership of convenience. It was love, fierce and protective, forged in the crucible of hardship and sealed in the face of adversity. When they arrived back at the cabin, the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the valley, painting the snow-dusted peaks in hues of rose and gold. The air was soft with the promise of spring. Jedediah helped her down from the wagon, but this time he did not let go of her hand. He held it gently, his large, calloused fingers wrapping around hers as if he never intended to let go. He led her not into the cabin, but to the small patch of earth under the window where her herbs were now growing, tiny green flags of defiance against the lingering winter. He knelt, his gaze on the tender shoots. "You make things grow here," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "Not just these. You've made this place a home." He finally looked up at her, and the clear gray of his eyes was soft, vulnerable, and filled with a depth of feeling that stole her breath. "That paper, what I paid the agent, that was for the debt. That was business." He stood up, closing the small distance between them. "But you, Lin Yue, you are not a debt. You are not a cook. You are my wife." He said the word wife as if it were a sacred vow, imbuing it with all the unspoken love and respect he held in his heart. "My true wife." Tears welled in Lin Yue's eyes, tears not of sorrow or fear, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. All her life she had been told what she was, a burden, an outsider, a commodity. But this man, this quiet, steadfast man, saw her for who she truly was. He saw her strength, her spirit, her heart. "Jedediah," she whispered, her voice trembling. He reached out and gently brushed a tear from her cheek, his touch as tender as it had been when he'd wiped the flour away. And then he lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or demand, but of homecoming. It was a silent promise of a shared future, of a love as quiet and as enduring as the mountains that watched over them. In his arms, surrounded by the home they had built together, Lin Yue was no longer the unseen underdog. She was loved. She was home. Her story wasn't about changing who she was to fit in. It was about the quiet, revolutionary power of being exactly who you are, with so much integrity and kindness that the world around you can't help but change. She never raised her voice, never fought prejudice with anger. She fought it with warm bread, with nourishing stew, with a steadfast heart that refused to be hardened by the cruelty of others. She taught a lonely man that a house is not a home until it is filled with care, and she taught a fearful town that a stranger is only a stranger until you share a meal with them. Her strength wasn't in a loud declaration, but in the quiet, consistent act of showing up, of tending her garden, of keeping the fire lit. It's a reminder that the most profound changes in our lives and in our communities often don't come from grand gestures, but from the small, repeated acts of goodness. It's the courage to offer warmth in a cold world, to plant a seed of hope in frozen ground. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply to cook a meal for someone who has wronged you, to show them a kindness they don't deserve, and in doing so, remind them of their own humanity. Her journey shows that your value is not determined by the labels others put on you, but by the love you cultivate and the good you put out into the world. So, as you go about your day, remember the girl in the dark red dress. Remember that your quietest strengths might just be your most powerful. If her story of resilience and love touched your heart, tap the subscribe button and join us for more stories that remind us of the enduring power of the human spirit.